I too am not an expert in Obamacare, but I did pledge in 2010, and I will refer to it, just to back up, as Obamacare, because I truly think that it will be a disaster if it goes forward and is implemented, and that we may, in the end up calling it something more like abominable care. This is making sort of a humming sound, so if it continues, I'll just get rid of the mic. How do I turn this off? If you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll speak up. I'm going to cover a few of the legal issues and how I expect the states and governors, businesses, and individuals who will be fighting the implementation of Obamacare, what they're likely to do in the coming months and years. First of all, in upholding the constitutionality of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which I will call abominable care or Obamacare, the U.S. Supreme Court has hardly ended the fight over health care reform, but it has merely changed the venue. There is still plenty of time to fight over this law, and the purpose of my brief talk is simply to highlight some of the ways in which states and others are taking up the fight. The Supreme Court's ruling this past summer not only guaranteed that Obamacare will be an issue in this fall's federal elections, but it actually dumped a mess in the laps of governors and state legislators too. It increases federal spending, taxes, and debt. It adds new burdens to struggling businesses, making it harder for them to grow and hire new workers, as you'll hear. It drives up the cost of health insurance, especially for the young and the healthy, while putting in place structures that will almost inevitably lead to the rationing of care, as we've seen in Canada and in England and in other countries that have these types of plans in place, or plans, I would say government-run plans. The reason why so many Americans, just to back up and look at the big picture, the reason that so many of us reject Obamacare and oppose it vigorously is that we see it as an enormous expansion of federal power, contrary to the Constitution, the historical American traditions, and our own innate dislike of big government. And by calling Obamacare a tax, as the U.S. Supreme Court did this past summer, and upholding the government's power to force you to buy health insurance, the court basically said that there is nothing that the federal government can't do so long as it calls it a tax, or require you to do so long as it's called a tax. Unrestrained and unlimited government power is a thing to be feared. Indeed, Gallup found that nearly 2/3 of Americans believe that big government is the biggest threat to the future of this country. Far more, that's 2/3 believe that, far more than the people who believe that big business is a threat, the critical threat, that's 26%, or big labor, that's 8%. So this president and the federal government's desire for power not only explains the president's policies, but also his distaste for the democratic process, particularly when it stands in the way of his doing what he thinks must be done. Now, there are many things that we could do because people need those things. I mean, people need a car to get to work. Are we now going to tax everyone so that employers and require employers to provide cars or transportation? Everyone needs food, and hopefully healthy food to eat, and a good night's sleep. And are we going to now, mandate costs to be incurred by the public at large to pay for these types of goods to be provided? A good summary of where this goes, for those of you who didn't come from other countries that have already put these policies in place. And there are plenty of Americans who came here from other countries that already have these policies, and they see that when you spread the wealth around and tax everyone to pay for whatever the people need, that it only leads to poverty. And a good story that depicts this is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I'm not discussing her, saying that you have to agree with her view of the world or her philosophy, but she came from Russia, she came here to America, she worked hard to get here, and that book is the second most widely read book in the history of America for a reason. The Bible's #1, and Atlas Shrugged is #2. And if you don't care anything about the philosophy behind the story, I suggest you read it just to understand where these types of government programs lead. They will bankrupt us, they will lead us to poverty. The Supreme Court's decision has only caused states, businesses, colleges, and religious organizations to double down in their efforts to thwart implementation of this unwise program. For if the Supreme Court had struck down Obamacare, the court would have said that the power of government over our lives has limits, that there are some lines that government cannot cross, even when well-intentioned. But the court said exactly the opposite. So again, if federal power is wielded as a tax, it at this point is virtually unlimited. Now, instead of making insurance more widely available and affordable, Obamacare actually drives up the cost of insurance. And we've already seen this. Many employers and colleges and religious institutions, not over the requirement to provide contraception, but religious institutions that provide have dropped providing health coverage and insurance and offering it, and employers and colleges already, because the costs have been driven up because so many more things have to be provided by this insurance. Now, what Congress can do we're going to talk a little bit about different ways of blocking the implementation of Obamacare. What Congress can do, and what congressional Republicans have vowed to do, is to keep fighting the law by repealing it or refusing to fund it. If Republicans continue to control the House of Representatives after the November elections, they may have the power to obstruct implementation of the law. Whether you think that's good or bad, I'm just going through the laundry list. If Congress wins both the houses of Congress and Romney is elected president, then repeal becomes a real possibility. So, but what remains, whatever happens in Congress, in Washington, is a lot of trench warfare at the state level. Now, there are a few things, actually really two things that states can do to try to block Obamacare. First, they can block what's called the Medicaid expansion. And the second thing that they can do is block the establishment, the setup of what's called an exchange. And I'm just going to go through and tell you a little bit about each of those. I'm not an expert on any of this, but we'll give you a little bit of an overview, and if you want more information, I can suggest where you might go. So first of all, blocking the Medicaid expansion. As most of you probably know, Obamacare requires the states to expand the pool of residents that qualify for Medicaid. And the Supreme Court decision actually makes that language even more favorable to states who want to fight this forced Medicaid expansion. And what the Supreme Court decision says is that originally Obamacare said if a state doesn't expand the pool, doesn't comply with this requirement to expand the pool of those who qualify for Medicaid, then the federal government would punish a state by taking away the federal funds that have been sent to that state for their existing Medicaid program. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can help fund the program, but you can't punish the states if they decide not to expand the program. So there's a little bit more room now after the Supreme Court decision for states to fight on the Medicaid front. But the way the money works, the way it's flowing from Washington to the states, and remember, it's all our money, so whether it comes from the federal government or the state government, you and I are going to be paying for this. If it goes forward. But the way the money flows makes it very difficult for states to, in the end, really hold out and fight this Medicaid expansion. Because in the first 3 years, if you do the expansion, you get full federal funding, so it sounds like free money, but again, it's all from increased taxes imposed on us. And then after that, it's something like 90%. So it will be very hard politically if this law isn't repealed or revised or changed in a way that makes sense. It will make it very hard politically for the states who are now saying that they will fight this Medicaid expansion to continue fighting it because they will be forced to accept this supposedly free money. So the first thing the states can do to try to fight the implementation of Obamacare is to not go along with this expansion of Medicaid. The second thing they can do is refuse or just sort of fail to form what's called an exchange. And the states are essential to getting this whole Obamacare program up and running. And if they drag their heels on this requirement to set up an exchange, they could really turn the whole program upside down. Now, 27 states, as you'll recall, joined the lawsuit against Obamacare that was decided this past summer, or filed other suits objecting to the law in some way. Only 16 states so far, which means that 34 have not. Only 16 states have gone forward setting up an exchange, or even started preparing to set one up, even though the deadline is January 1st of 2014. So this means to many people who are more knowledgeable about these exchanges that those who haven't even started preparing could easily miss this deadline. There are some who support Obamacare who really say that the Republican governors who balked at creating these new private insurance markets may end up with, which is what they call them. If anything the government creates is really a market, then you know more than I do about these. But they're calling them new private insurance markets. May end up, those who are proponents of Obamacare believe that the Republican governors who are balking at creating these exchanges will actually end up wearing this around their neck. Now, the way it will work is that these contractors are going to design and test computer systems that would make this create this federal exchange, and the Democrats estimate the price tag is about $860 million to do that. For the half states that they estimate won't set up state exchanges. What the real number is, we don't really know. So anyway, there'll be a website, you'll put in your zip code, you'll get a list of available health plans, there'll be a section where you can find out if you qualify for subsidies, or whether you might need to look at Medicaid. There'll be cost calculators to allow you to compare different levels of coverage. Platinum, gold, this is the people selling it to you. Platinum, silver, gold, bronze. There'll be tools to allow you to see if your doctor or hospital is within a particular plan. But it's clear that there will be many more rounds to this fight. And I would throw in one further, or I will just mention it once more as I did on the campaign trail, and that is ultimately the states have authority over the federal government. That's the type of government that we set up in our country. We're not a democracy, so all those textbooks that say we're a democracy, just rip out that page. That was an effort by the left in our country to try to teach our school children that we're a democracy. We're actually a constitutional republic. And so that a democracy in the form of a constitutional republic. And which means that, as you all know, a democracy is the tyranny of the majority. If you have enough votes, you can impose your will on the minority. That's not the situation that we have in this country. We have a constitution that protects the rights of certain types of minorities, people with minority interests, minority views, and then we have our whole representative form of government. But the states ultimately created the federal government, and under the federal constitution have certain rights are reserved for the states. Certain authority was conferred on the federal government. The rest of the authority over our country was reserved for the states, or if not granted to the states, reserved for the people. So ultimately, this is really going to come down to sort of a nullification type of fight. And whatever you hear from one side of the political aisle about nullification, nullification has been used from the very beginning of this country, going back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Fugitive Slave Law. The North believed the Fugitive Slave Law was unconstitutional, and I came from a town in Vermont where there are still houses along Main Street where there are hiding places for slaves behind fake panels and behind chimneys and things, because people said, no, this law is unconstitutional, we're not going to obey it. But states, in a formal way, through their state legislatures, can make a decision that they find a law unconstitutional. The Supreme Court decides individual cases on specific facts, but the states can decide on a statewide basis as a whole that a law is unconstitutional, and that's always been part of our form of government. I don't think we're going to end up there. I think that we're going to get this resolved through the next election, but that is an option. It's always been an option, and it's been used many times throughout our history, from the beginning right through to the present. And I'd be happy to take questions when we get to the end of the presentations. Thank you.